All right, hello everybody. What's going on? This your girl Tiffany coming through live in effect right here on the StreamYard. So if you are looking at from my YouTube channel, please make sure you share and subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. If you're watching from Facebook, make sure you share this video right here. So today I'm dealing with the Black History Daily as always. However, this is going to be a little something different in Black history that's not often talked about or not really brought up into the subject matter because it seems to be very questionable for one, for many people, and then two, it raises a lot of red flags, and three, it's very controversial. So the topic that I'm going to deal with today is about Anthony Johnson. A man named Anthony Johnson, was he a black slave owner? So what people don't know in history, not only there were Caucasian people that owned slaves, but there were also Native American Indians, which one of these days we're gonna go into about the Native American Indians owning slaves. And then there's also blacks who had owned slaves too. So I got some information online, and also I got some information in handy. I got an article. It's called "Black Slaves Owner" by Philip Burham. So I'm gonna read a little bit of that, but we're gonna look into who is Anthony Johnson. All right. So let's get started. So this supposed to be a picture of him. I'm not sure if this is the correct picture. Not sure, but this is the image that we came up with so far. So now, what I want to do is I'm going to go here to blackpast.org. All right. And I'm just going to read a little bit about his biography on this page. All right. So it says Anthony Johnson was the first prominent black landholder in the English colonies. Johnson arrived in Virginia in 1621 aboard the James. It is uncertain if Johnson arrived as an indentured servant or as a slave. Early records list him as Antonio, a Negro. Regardless of his status, Johnson was bound labor and was put to work on Edwards Bennett's tobacco plantation near Warren's Cokie, Virginia. In March of 1622, local Tidewater Indians attacked Bennett's plantation, killing 52 people. Johnson was one of only 5 on the plantation who survived the attack. So far we know that he came to America or to the colonies. He arrived in Virginia, and in some sources it stated that he arrived from Angola, right? So they're not sure if he was an indentured slave or if he was a slave himself. So let's read along, and then we're gonna look at other sources. All right, so then goes down to say in 1622, Mary, a Negro woman, arrived aboard the Margaret and John, and like Anthony, she ended up on Bennett's plantation. At some point, Anthony and Mary were married. A 1653 Northampton County Court documents lists Mary as Anthony's wife. It was preposterous and enduring union that lasted over 40 years and produced at least 4 children, including 2 sons and 2 daughters. The couple was respected in their community for their hard labor and known service, according to court documents. So let's see right here. At some point between 1625 and 1640, Anthony and Mary gained their freedom and moved to Virginia's eastern shore, where they purchased a modest estate. They began raising cattle and hogs, and by 1651, Johnson claimed 250 acres of land along was it Pungoteague Creek. He claimed the land by virtue of 5 head rights, one of which was in the name of his son Richard Johnson. It is impossible to know if Anthony imported the other men whose names appear on the head right land claims, but it is possible that he did. It is also possible that he purchased head right certificates from other planters. Either way, 250 acres was a sizable plantation by standards of the day. By 1654, Johnson's two sons, Richard and John, both owned acreage adjoining their father's land. Okay, so he went on and got married, and he was able to purchase 250 acres. Now, African Americans of today talk about 40 acres and a mule, right? But 250 acres, that's a large land. So let's see what else he did. And it says, in addition to being a landowner, Anthony Johnson was also a slaveholder. Court records reveal that Johnson won a 1655 case against white planter Robert Parker to retain ownership of Johnson's slave, John Casser. Casser, with the help of Robert Parker, tried to claim that he was an indentured servant, not a slave. Although the courts initially found in Parker's favor, temporarily freeing Casser, they subsequently reversed the decision, returning Casser to the service of his master, Anthony Johnson. So, again, there's a possibility and chance that so far, just based on this source, it does say that he was a slave owner. Right, not only he had land, but he also owned a slave named John Casser. So we're going to look up who John Casser was real quick. Let's look up John Casser. All right, so here it is. All right, so here's a little bit of information that came from Wiki. And the references is down here at the bottom, as you can see, to verify. All right, so it says John Casser, surname also recorded as Kazara or Kosala, a servant in Northampton County in Virginia colony in 1655, became the first person of African descent in English 13 colonies to be declared as a slave for life as a result of a civil suit. In an earlier case, John Punch was the first man documented as a slave in the Virginia colony, sentenced to life in servitude for attempting to escape his indenture. In one of the earliest Okay, so this right here, this is interesting. So it says John Casser was declared to be a slave for life as a civil suit, but John Punch was the first man to be documented as a slave in the Virginia colony and sentenced to life in servitude. So one might ask then, well, what's the difference? So this is the question that I must ask then. What's the difference between John Punch and John Casser? Because if John Punch was sentenced to be a slave, right, in the Virginia colony and served life in servitude for escaping his indenture, then what's the difference with John Casser? being a slave for life. So both of them were one of the first to be a slave, right? Or to be documented as slaves in this country before slavery became a legalized business, right? I mean, to me, this is something interesting, very interesting. But let's go ahead and look down. Let's read some more because I'm gonna read into who John Punch was. All right, but let's go down here. It says, in one of the earliest freedom suits, Castle argued that he was an indentured servant who had been forced by Anthony Johnson, a free black, to serve past his term. He was free and went to work for Robert Parker as an indentured servant. Johnson sued Parker for Castle's service in ordering Castle return to his master Johnson for life. The court both declared Castle a slave and sustained the right of free blacks to own slaves. Wait, it says the court both declared Castle a slave and sustained the right of free blacks to own slaves. So slavery law hardened during Castle's lifetime. In 1662, the Virginia colony passed a law incorporating the principle of praeter sequentur venum. So this means right here, praeter sequentur venum basically means like if your mother was a slave, and that's a Latin term. If your mother was a slave, then you'll be born into slavery. But if your mother was not a slave, then you'll be born free. Even that goes for kids who was biracial. So if they had a African mother that was enslaved, then they will be born to slavery. If they had a white mother, a Caucasian mother, then they'll be born free. That's just the way the law was. See, it says right here, ruling that children of enslaved mother will be born into slavery regardless of their father's race or status. And this was in contradiction to English common law for English subjects, which based a child's status on that of the father. In 1699, Virginia passed a law deporting all free blacks, but many new families of free blacks continued to be formed during the colonial years by the close relationship among the working class. So, according to that information, there were some free blacks that were able to own slaves. So now we don't know as many free black people who had slaves so far, but we know that Anthony Johnson was said to be one of them. So, real fast, let's go down here where it says background. At this time, there were only about 300 people of African origin living in the colony, in the Virginia colony, about 1% of an estimated population of 30,000. The first group of 20 or so Africans were brought to Jamestown in 1619 as indentured slave servants. After working out their contracts for passage money to Virginia and completing their indenture, each was granted 50 acres, 20 high of land head rights. This enabled them to raise their own tobacco or other crops. Now it says, although most historians believe slavery as an institution developed much later, they differ on the exact status of their servitude before slavery was established, as well as differing over the date when this took place. The colonial charter entitled English subjects and their children the rights of the common law, but people of other nations were considered foreigners or alien outside of the common law. At the time, the colony had no provision for naturalizing foreigners. Oh, that's interesting. So let's get back to the story about Anthony Johnson, right? And then we're going to read furthermore about John Castor and John Punch. All right, so here it is, right here. I'm on blackpass.org, and it says that a fire in 1653 destroyed much of Johnston Plantation. As a result of the fire, Anthony and Mary petitioned the court for tax relief, which was granted on the grounds that they would have difficulty obtaining a livelihood. Sometime in the 1660s, Anthony and Mary Johnson, their dependent children, and their married sons, John and Richard, all moved into Maryland. In Maryland, Anthony leased a 300-acre farm, Tony's Vineyard, where he lived until his death in 1670. Mary survived her husband, and in her 1672, she bequeathed a cow to each of her grandsons. 5 years later, in 1677, Anthony and Mary's grandson, John Jr. purchased a 44-acre farm, which he named Angola, and John Jr. later died without leaving an heir. However, and by 1730, the Johnson family has vanished from the historical records. So that's why you don't hear about much historical information regarding to Anthony Johnson and his family, because they were vanished. So, because it says down here, by 1730, the Johnson family had vanished from the historical records. So the information was lost. So historians was only able to retrieve as much information as they possibly could about this man. So let's read furthermore. Let's read furthermore into this. Okay, let's see what else they got to say about Anthony Johnson. But let's go here because I'm on the webarchive.org. All right. And it says the African American experience, history of Black Americans from Africa to the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom, Philip S. Farner, slaves and free Blacks in the Southern colonies. Now, right here where it says Virginia. So we're going to skip down. Okay, so we're going to start right here. It says, today, most historians agree that although the history of the Negro in Virginia begins in 1619, the history of the Negro as a slave did not begin until later. They differ, however, on the exact status of the Negro during the time lag before slavery was established, and they argue over the date when enslavement took place. Now, let's read right here. It says today, the fact that the early Negroes imported into Virginia held the status of indentured servants, what is shown by the records of some Negroes receiving the customary freedom dues in the form of land at the end of their term of service. Some obtained land after becoming free by importing servants under the head right, not only held Black servants, but were sufficiently prosperous to pay the transportation costs of a white imported into Virginia in 1622. Hold on, wait a minute. Okay, let me go back and read that. But were sufficiently prosperous to pay the transportation costs of white indentured servants. through each of whom they could obtain 50 acres of land. Anthony Johnson, who was imported into Virginia in 1622, accumulated property after he ended his indenture period. And even though he lost all his holdings in a fire, was able by 1651 to import 5 black servants into the colony, for which he was granted 250 acres in Northampton County. In about 1650, Benjamin Dole, a Negro, was granted 300 acres of land. Hold on. Right here where it says about 1650, Benjamin Dole, a Negro, was granted 300 acres of land in Surrey County for having imported 6 servants. Another Negro was granted 550 acres after importing 11 people. So these Negroes, right, these black people, they were granted land after they did that indenture work and imported some black slaves over to work on the land. So as long as they imported some black slaves and they completed their work, they were offered land. So the point is, not all of our ancestors were in slavery. I mean, majority of them were, but there were those who were already free and who were already granted some land, and they had indentured workers. But again, there's only a little bit information regarding to how many of them were free and how many of them had slaves. But so far, what we reading, it was 2 more that was granted 300 acres. Now, remind you, this is during the time where blacks were transported over to Virginia in the 1600s. It was during that time period. But let's find out more. Okay, then it goes on to say Anthony Johnson was the black patriarch of the first community of Negroes, property owners in America, established along the banks of, Pocotee River. Although their number was relatively small, the existence of Negro property owners. Okay, so it says here, keyword, although their number was relatively small. So it was a small number of black people that owned slaves, right? But then it goes on to say the very existence of Negro property owners in 17th century Virginia reveals that for an early period of time. And then it goes on to say right here, blacks were financially able either to pay for the transportation of indentured servants from Europe or Africa or both, or to purchase property from native Virginians. So according to that information, there was only a small number, relatively a small number of Negroes who were slave masters and who was able to afford to pay for indentured slaves or indentured servants or slaves to come and work on the plantation. And some of them were able to afford to buy property from those who were the native of Virginia. Now, but that's interesting, right? Very interesting. Okay. Now, let's read furthermore right here. And it says, but even while these rights were enjoyed by some black, even when there were only few blacks in the colony and white servants still formed the backbone of the labor force, there were distinctions between black and white. This distinction existed in the servant's status itself. For although the black servant often was capable of contracting Negroes usually did not, like white servants, have the benefits of writing indentures defining their rights and limiting their periods of service. This lack of labor contracts facilitated their permanent enslavement. The colonists drew other distinction. In September of 1630, when there were only 200 Negroes in Virginia, the General Court ordered Hugh Davis to be soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and the shame of Christians. Let's stop right there. This is one of the reasons why religion is being looked at as the enemy to certain people. Because remember, they use religion as a justification for slavery. So that's why if you ever heard the term the Black Bible, what is it called? The Bible Belt State. So the Bible's, let me look up the term real fast. Okay, so let's look up the term Bible Belt. What is the Bible Belt? Bible Belt is an informal region in the southern United States, right, in which socially conservative and evangelical Protestantism plays a strong role in society and politics and church attendance across the denomination. The denomination is generally higher than the nation's average. Okay, so and it says the name Bible Belt has been applied historically to the South and parts of the Midwest, but is more commonly identified with the South. Now let's look at this. How did the concept of the Bible Belt came about? During the colonial period of 1607 to 1776, the South was a stronghold of the Anglican Church. Its transition to a stronghold of non-Anglican Protestantism occurred gradually over the next centuries as a series of religious revival movements, many associated with the Baptist denomination, granted the great popularity in the region. Okay, so as we can see here, that's when the Bible Belt came about. It was around 1601 to 1776 that the southern states from the southeast all the way up to the southwest were the Bible Belt state. So like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, all considered as Bible Belt state. So to bring about justification of slavery, that's what they use. They use the Bible to justify. They use the verses in the Bible. And when we go back and read what it says, the General Court ordered Hugh Davis to be soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to dishonor of God and the shame of Christians. Dishonor of God and the shame of Christians. Let's think about that for a moment. And it says, by defiling his body in line with a Negro. In other words, a white man was accused of dishonoring himself. Oh, he was a white guy. Oh, okay. Okay, so he was a white guy. So the white man was beaten for sleeping. The white man says, in other words, a white man was accused of dishonoring himself and defiling his body because he had sexual relation with a Negro woman. Winthrop Jordan points out that it is unclear if the crime was fornication or interracial sex, but the evidence would seem to lead to the latter interpretation. And then it goes on to say, then in July of 1639, the assembly made an even clearer distinction between black and white by providing that all persons except Negroes are to be provided with arms and ammunition. Only Negroes, no one else, were prohibited from carrying guns. So another distinction came about where white people were given the opportunity to have weapons, to bear arms, but black people couldn't bear arms. All right. Okay, so all right, I got about 15 more minutes left to kill. Maybe 20 more minutes. All right. So let's look at down here where it says servitude. Let's go over here. So servitude for life. One essence of slavery occurred in July of 1640 in a case involving 3 runaway servants, 2 white, 1 black. The white servants, a Scot and a Dutchman, were required to serve an additional 4 years after the time of their serving is expired. The third, being a Negro named John Punch, was ordered to serve his master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Lifetime servants. In effect, slavery was instituted for the Negro, not the white, even though all 3 were guilty of the same offense. So, in the lifetime, the Negro had to serve slavery. But for those who were right, for the white people that was indentured servant, they only had to serve for temporary and they can go free, while the Negroes had to stay. And then it says some Negro servants were forced to serve for life by masters who simply refused to acknowledge that the period of indenture was completed. A preceding setting case was that of Johnson versus Parker, and we already read that part, right? So we're gonna get into more about John Casler and John Punch. Other evidence that Virginia Negroes were serving for life in the 1650s is the fact that in 1660 is an act concerning runaways. The assembly stated that in case any English servant shall run away in company with any Negroes who are incapable of making satisfaction by addition of time, he shall serve for the time of the said Negroes absent. While it does not say so in so many words, the statute indicates quite clearly that Negroes served for life and hence could not make satisfaction by serving longer once they were recaptured. This phrase gave legal status to the already existing practice of lifetime enslavement of Negroes. All right. So with that being said, child slavery began years later, but it was in a slow process, right? But so in the very beginning, there were indentured servants. That means they were working for somebody and they were getting paid to work. However, Only certain ones earned their freedom, while the rest had to stay and work for the rest of their life. And the ones that had to stay to work were the black ones. So far, what we know that there were free blacks that owned some slaves, that had some property, but it was a very small amount of them. But so let's look at, when did chattel slavery come into play? Hmm. Let's see. Okay. Let's look. Let's look this up right here. Now we're gonna stop right here. Then we're gonna continue on with another article. But what was the status of offspring of Negro slaves? The English common law gave a child the status of his father, but also the colony's mulatto population was increasing, and to follow the common law would grant their offspring the status of the white father. The Virginia Assembly solved this problem for plantation owners in 1662 by declaring that whereas some doubts have arisen whether children go by any English man upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free, it be it enacted that all children born in this country shall be free, shall be bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. By this legislation, lifelong servitude was made self-perpetuating, and Negroes could be born into slavery. Indeed, the assembly stated that the children of slave mothers were property in the same manner as the natural increase of livestock or other chattel. The question of the Negro slave who was a Christian posed a naive problem for the Virginia colonists. British common law required that slaves who became Christian be free, and the Virginians too adhered to the principle that conversion of baptism would provide grounds for relief from life servitude. Right, in 1644, a case occurred in which a baptized mulatto servant, although acquired as a slave forever, was declared by the court not to be a slave, but to serve as other Christian servants do. In January of 1655, Elizabeth Key, daughter of a slave woman, successfully brought suit for her freedom on the ground that her baptism entitled her to this status. It is likely that other slaves brought similar suits. Not surprisingly, the Virginians were reluctant to have their slaves baptized and given Christian instruction lest they be required to set them free. So by an act of September of 1667, the General Assembly declared that in the case of children there are slaves by birth, the conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of a person as to his bondage or freedom, that the verbs masters freed from his doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity. At the same time, to make doubly certain that they would not be troubled with suit claiming baptism as a reason for changing a black's status from slave to servant or for his outright release, Virginians denied blacks access to the courts. In these ways, the Virginian slaveholders could now accommodate their religion to emerging system of Negroes enslavement. So let's start right there. So at one point in time, right, uh, if a Negro or if a black person converted into Christianity, they were more than likely to become free. But then the Virginian law changed, and use Christianity as the foundation to bring about a justification of slavery. So they said, well, you know what? It don't matter if you become a Christian now. Because guess what? You still got to be a slave. So at once upon a time, yeah, you was able to be free. Yeah, your ancestor was able to be free. But now it's different. So just because you convert into a religion, you're not automatically free. You enslaved. And you got to work as a slave until we set you free. So basically that was the attitude when the laws came into place. All right, so let's see. We're going to get off of that. And let's take a look at okay, so let's look at what happened with John Casser, the slave of Anthony Johnson. All right, and it says the horrible fate of John Casser, the first black man to be declared slave for life in America. Black people in early America weren't slaves. After this lawsuit, they could be. Okay, so let's see if we can look furthermore. All right, so it says Castor was originally an indentured servant, which meant he was practically a slave in some senses. But what was bought or sold wasn't him. It was his contract of indentured, which obligated him to work for its holder for the period it set. At the end of that time, indentured servant who could be of any race were considered legally free and sent out into the world. All right, it says this might sound like a rough deal, but indentured how the British colonists who lived in what would later become the United States managed to populate the land and get enough people to do back-breaking work of farming crops like tobacco in the South. People who survived their period of indentured, many didn't, went on to live free lives in the colonies, often after receiving some kind of small compensation like clothes, land, or tools to help set them up, writes Ariana Cal for Today I Found Out. And then it goes on to say that was the incentive that caused many poor whites to indenture themselves and their families and move to the so-called New World. But Africans who were indentured were often captured and brought over against their will. That's what happened to the holder of Castor indenture, Anthony Johnson. So Johnson served out his contract and went on to run his own tobacco farm and hold his own indentured servants. Among them Castor. At this time, the colony of Virginia had very few black people in it. Johnson was one of the original 20. All right. So let's see. We're gonna go in about John Punch, right? And it says, of course, as Wesleyan University notes, the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to Americas had been around for over a century already, originating around 1500. Slaves usually captured and sold by other African tribes. Hold on. Let's look at this part right here. Of course, as Wesleyan University notes, the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to Americas had been around for over a century, already originated around 1500. Slaves, usually captured and sold by other African tribes, were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. The University blogs notes around 11 million people were transported from 1500 to 1850, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean islands. If they arrived in America originally, they became indentured servants. If they arrived elsewhere, they became slaves. I'm gonna read that one more time. As Wesleyan University notes, the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to Americas had been around for over a century already. Originated around 1500, slaves usually captured and sold by other African tribes were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. The university blog notes around 11 million people were transported from 1500 to 1850, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean islands. If they arrived in America originally, they became indentured servants. If they arrived elsewhere, they became slaves. So, if they go elsewhere, they were slaves. But if they come here, they were the indentured servants. And that's how they started. So again, they were forced against their own will, but they were not working as chattel slaves. They were working as indentured slaves, and then eventually they became chattel slaves. And we're talking about black people. So in the beginning, it was black and whites that was doing indentured servants, but it would be the African Americans or blacks or African people that will be victims of chattel slavery. Okay, so now I'm just trying to rest this all out. Now I'm trying to make some sense of it. Okay, I'm trying to gain some understanding. Mm. Let's read this part right here. Oh, we. And it says about 7 years later, Virginia made this practice legal for everyone in 1661. Hold on. Let's go right here where it says Castle's story is particularly grimy in hindsight. His slip into slavery will be followed by many other people of African descent who were declared property in what became the United States. It was a watershed moment in the history of institutional slavery. Okay, about 7 years later, Virginia made this practice legal for everyone in 1661 by making it state law for any free white, black, or Indian. About 7 years later, Virginia made this practice legal for everyone in 1661 by making it state law for any free white, black, or Indian to be able to own slaves along with indentured servants. Kyle writes, the step from there to a racialized idea of slavery wasn't a huge one, she writes, and by the time Johnson died in 1670, his race was used to justify giving his plantation to a white man rather than Johnson's children by his wife, Mary. He was not a citizen of the colony, a judge ruled, because he was black. Oh, so that's why the information was lost, because at the end of the day, when he passed on, right, his plantation was given over to a white man and not to his wife and children, all because Anthony Johnson was not a citizen of the colony. And the reason why he was not a citizen of the colony was because he was a black man. So therefore, the family lost. They lost everything. They lost everything over to a white man. So when they thought they was winning by owning slaves, right, and having all these acre of land, just to lose everything over to a white person, because they were not considered as naturalized or citizen of the country. They were free people, but they were not citizen because of their skin. So at one point, it became racial. Afterwards, once the Negro became the victim of slavery. So when they became victim of slavery, that's when the racism came into existence. And racism dealt with power, dealt with system, dealt with political, economic, and social control over a group of people. So it went from having indentured slaves, indentured workers, indentured servants, to owning slaves, to have chattel slavery, and to base it off of race. So at this point, anybody could have owned slave, white, black, or Indian. However, the blacks were not going to get as much privilege as the whites when it came to owning slaves. And eventually, as we can see here, when Anthony Johnson passed on, his whole empire was turned over to a white person, because at this time, it was about racial status. That's what it was about. So let's look at John Punch real fast, and then I'm going to go ahead and get off of here. So let's look at John Punch. Who was John Punch? All right. Let's go ahead and look up. Okay, so there's some images of him. So let's look at who John Punch was. Hold on, let's see something. All right. So right here, John Punch, slave. And they don't know if he was born in Cameroon, Gabon, or Ivory Coast, but he was somewhere from Africa. All right. He was from York County, colony of Virginia. So John Punch, right, was said to be the first enslaved African, right, in the colony of Virginia. So let's read real brief. John Punch was an enslaved African who lived in the colony of Virginia. Though to have been an indentured servant, Punch attempted to escape to Maryland and was sentenced in July 1640 by the Virginia Governor's Council to serve as a slave for the remainder of his life. Two European men who ran away with him received a lighter sentence of extended indentured servitude. For this reason, historians consider John Punch the first official slave in the English colonies, and his case was the first legal sanctioning of lifelong slavery in the Chesapeake. Historians also consider this to be one of the first legal distinction between Europeans and Africans made in the colony, and a key milestone in the development of the institution of slavery in the United States. And then what did it say about Barack Obama? Hold on. It says, in July of 2020, Ancestry.com published a paper suggesting that John Punch was the 12th generation grandfather of President Barack Obama on his mother's side. On the basis of historic and genealogical research and Y-DNA analysis, Punch descendants were known by the Bunch surname. Punch is also believed to be one of the paternal ancestors of the 20th century American diplomat Ralph Bunche, the first African American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Wow. All right. So I'm put it back up. Okay, so I'm reading a little story about John Punch. Okay, so let's see. Let's look at let's look at John H. Russell defines slavery in his book, The Free Negro in Virginia in 1619 to 1865. The difference between servants and a slave is elementary and fundamental. The loss of liberty to a servant was temporary. The bondage of the slave was perpetual. It is the distinction made by Beverly in 1705 when he wrote, "They are called slaves in respect of the time of their servitude, because it is for life. Wherever, according to the customs and law of the colony, Negroes were regarded and held as servants without a future right to freedom, there we should find the beginning of slavery in that colony." And this is historians have noted that John Punch ceased to be an indentured servant and was condemned to slavery, as he was sentenced to servant his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Edgar Toppins states that Punch, in effect, became a slave under this ruling. A Leon Higginbotham Jr. said, thus, although he committed the same crime as the Dutchman and Scotsman, John Punch, a black man, was sentenced to lifetime slavery. Winthrop Johnson also described this court ruling as the first definite indication of outright enslavement appears in Virginia. The third being a Negro named John Punch shall serve his his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. And then somebody else put Theodore W. Allen notes that the courts being a Negro justification made no explicit reference to proceeding in English or Virginia common law and suggests that the court members may have been aware of common law that held a Christian could not enslave a Christian, with Punch being presumed to be a non-Christian unlike his accomplice, wary of the diplomat friction that would come of enslaving non-English European, and possibly hopeful of reciprocating the lifetime indentures of African slaves held in the Caribbean and South American colonies. Let's see. So we're gonna skip down. There go the references at the bottom. And if you want to learn more about John Punch, you can come on wikiwan.com and you can just look it up. All right. And it says further reading right here. External links. Okay. So you can look all that information up. And that's John Punch Slave. All right, so okay. I want to read something, right? I want to read something really fast from information I got a long time ago. It's called Black Slave Owners. Philip Burnham, right? And he wrote essays about more than 1,200 African slaves were owned by Americans who were themselves Black. How this came to be is, as Burnham also note, a fascinating and complex story. All right. So I want to read something. And it says here, this is around the 1830s. It says, according to the 1830s, U.S. Census reports 3,775 free Blacks living mostly in the South own a total of 12,760 slaves. Though the vast majority of these owned no more than a few slaves, some in Louisiana and South Carolina held as many as 70 or 80, nor was the South the only region to know Black slave owners. Their presence was recorded in Boston by 1724 and in Connecticut by 1783. As late as 1830, some Blacks still owned slaves in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York, as well as in the border states and the District of Columbia. And then it says the motives that guide Black slave owners were many and complex. Most of them appear to have owned slaves for the benevolent purpose of protecting family members from a society that habitually regard free Black people with deep suspicion. But a significant minority did so for the same reasons that motivated white slave owners: commercial profit and prestige. Slave owning on the part of this latter group was a strategy for assimilation in a mistrustful and potentially explosive social atmosphere. Not only were Black slave owners sometimes revived by other Blacks, but they were equally feared by the white middle class as potential absurd, absurd, whatever our stereotype of the American master in the antebellum era. Neither the commercial nor the humanitarian black slave owner easily fits it. Then I want to read on where it says a crucial prerequisite for slave owning was, of course, freedom. At the time of the 1830 census, nearly 1 out of 8 blacks in the United States were a free persons of color, whether by birthright, manumission, or the purchase of his or her freedom. Whatever their improved legal status, free people of color still experienced many of the same difficulties that slaves did. The laws differed according to period and region, but free blacks of the antebellum era were generally forbidden the right to vote, to bear arms, and to testify against whites in a court of law. They were often denied credit, co-signed to segregated churches, prevent from establishing permanent residence, and even denied license to sell liquor. They often lived side by side with slaves, on occasion marrying them, and their white neighbors tend to see them as a potentially disruptive force. Most free people of color were poor. They lived, as the historian John Hope Franklin has put it, in a state of quasi-freedom. So, the so-called free people, the free people of color, right, didn't technically earn a status as their white counterpart. So yeah, they were free, but they couldn't do a whole lot. And this was what I was reading. This was happening after slavery came into existence, right? This was around the 1830s. They still wasn't earning no status. So some black people thought, oh, if we own slaves, we can earn status and we can make profit and, the commercial. And guess what? That wasn't the case. They weren't making as much profit as their white counterpart. So it really wasn't doing them any justice to own any slaves, because at the end of the day, you were still going to be treated differently because of your skin color. Even before chattel slavery came about, guess what? White folks end up earning all the privilege, while the black people end up being on the back end of the burner. But anyways, with that being said, you guys, thank you for tuning in and watching. May peace and power elevation be to all of you. Until next time, please be safe out here. And remember, knowledge is important. And if you like what you're watching, you can go ahead and support this channel, right? You can go ahead and you can support this channel right here if you like what you're watching. You see my Cash App, $Tip World. If you like what you're looking at, if you are watching from Facebook, you can also share this channel too. It's on you. So, but again, thank you guys for those of you that was watching. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it a lot. So you guys, please be safe out there. Once again, stay on top of your knowledge game. Remember, always do research, because you're going to come across a lot of information that you didn't even know about. All right. All right. With that being the case, may peace and power elevation be to all of you, and take it easy. All right.